Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just about to start our webinar. We're going to wait a few minutes to let people join. So we'll get started here in just a little bit. All right, I think we might be ready to kick things off. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're here to discuss 2022 executive compensation benchmarks and search outlook. I'm Monica Gordon. I'm with the marketing department at Thrive. We're a software company that develops solutions for executive talent management professionals, specifically working with search firms, venture capital, and private equity firms and enterprises. With me today, I have my colleague Mike Mooney. He's SVP of Revenue at Thrive. Part of his team is responsible for nurturing the executive talent community, working with quarterly benchmarks and the podcast called Back Channel. And with us today as well is our guest, Steve Maxwell. He is VP of Portfolio and Human Capital at Audax Private Equity. He's worked in the search industry for a number of years prior to Audax and was the talent partner at Kodiak Venture Partners. So thank you so much for joining us, Steve. We're excited to have you here and to have you share your insights.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to pass things over to Mike Mooney to kick things off and dive a little bit more into the agenda.
Great. Thanks, Monica. And thanks to our friends over at Scanlon who helped us fill up the house quite a bit here today. So we're excited to share a lot of the benchmark data as well as some survey data we had recently. So going over the agenda here, it's broken out into 4 parts. We're going to start with an overview, which is an executive summary around some of the broader market dynamics and what got us to this point. And then we'll go into some of the hard data, the benchmarks around compensation, executive search volume and velocity. We'll take a look at a survey of executive search leaders, both search firms and in-house executive talent, as well as talent partners at VC and PE firms. And we'll look at an outlook for 2022, some trends we're seeing in terms of objectives and key results. And then we'll go into a spotlight where Steve will take over and talk through the evolving role of the investor talent partner, which we've seen, really an uptick in both hires and relevance of that role over time. Quick note, we're going to try to keep this as interactive as possible. In the bottom right of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. Any questions you have for the speakers, you can put in that Q&A button. In the chat is good for just general discussion or points of view. But if you have a question that you'd like answered, it's in that Q&A button on the bottom right-hand side. We'll also be doing a few polls throughout the presentation to see how everyone here, how their experience is footing with our broader data. So please be ready to answer those questions. There's about 3 of those throughout. Cool. So jumping into a very high level, and I assume if you're on this call, you're probably feeling a lot of these dynamics here. The broader trends we're seeing across the board is a very high demand for executive talent. Executive searches are through the roof. Executive compensation is following suit, and we're seeing comp go up quite a bit. More recently, we've seen search velocity or days to close go down, the velocity going down, the days to close going up. So searches are taking longer as of recently. And if you look at a lot of the leading indicators that we look at, it doesn't really seem like there's an end in sight. So we jump into what got us here. There are a few broader things that we think really have impacted the executive search market, starting with the fact that business is just booming. So if you look at public and private markets, a lot of records were set last year. If we zoom in on the top right chart here, what we're looking at in the red line are total new open executive searches, and we track that against VC deal value. So what this chart is telling us is as VC money is deployed into portfolio companies, more searches are being requested, which makes sense. I mean, obviously, with more money, the portfolio companies are going to grow and they're going to hire more executives. So we look at, deployed capital in dry powder as good leading indicators for us in terms of demand for executive search. And at the same time, business is booming, so is inflation. So in the bottom right-hand chart there, we look at US consumer inflation, and we compare that to median total cash compensation for executives. So if you look at an aggregate view of all executive compensation, total comp base plus bonus, and you compare that to US inflation, you can see it follows a very similar trend there since Q4 of 2020. This is, again, another leading indicator of where things might go with compensation as we see inflation either tick up or tick down. And then more specific to our space, we're seeing a lot of new talent dynamics come into play here with the great reshuffling, the great resignation. I think the jury's still out of how much this is impacting the executive space. But I think when it comes to the uncertainty and flakiness of candidates, we're seeing a lot of that. Remote placements are offering as much upside as there are challenges, and then capacity, both from talent partner point of view and search firm point of view, seeing some major constraints there. So I'll pause and kind of open it up to Steve. Looking at these broader dynamics, what's been your experience? Anything to kind of take a double click into here?
No, I think, you've hit on the point. These are heady times that brings both good news and bad news, right? It's great that all of these trends are in the right direction, but it makes our challenge to recruit top talent into the portfolio companies that much greater. So I think everybody has to just pay more attention to the process and realize that sometimes these compensation numbers, the numbers that you're going to show and the trends, sometimes you have to just step outside of those trends and do what's necessary to get the right person into the right role in this kind of market.
Yeah, with that amount of uncertainty, I imagine getting creative has got to be a superpower of those that are winning.
So Mike, it looks like we had an interesting question come in just in terms of the data that we're showing in terms of the compensation. So Terry Helton asked, in the 21st century, it appears that the demarcation between executive, manager, and supervisor is much grayer than 20th century. What's Thrive's definition of an executive versus a senior manager? Probably looking at how some of the data is being pulled and demonstrated here.
Oh, that's a great question. So with our platform, we typically, our clients are typically retained search professionals, whether that's in-house at a large company, a firm, or like a talent partner at a venture capital firm. So we define it as V level plus, so anything director or below. We have data on that, but we typically take it out of our benchmark data. So we stay at that V to C level. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Terry.
So moving forward to what's ahead, if we rely on those data points before as leading indicators on what's to come, and we see that things are basically tracking to those broader market dynamics. If you look at the PE market, there one report said that there was 1.3 trillion in dry powder as of September of 2022. So if deployed capital is going to be a leading indicator of search volume, probably can expect a lot of searches looking forward. I think there's a lot going on in the public markets. We don't really have a crystal ball, and we're not going to be reading tea leaves today, but I think that there's a lot going on to really wrap our heads around and figure out. But if you look at some hard data, it seems like there's a lot of dry powder, which we think is going to translate to a lot of searches this year. And then when we ran our sentiment survey of about 150 executive talent professionals, more than half of folks expected the already very frothy market of 2021 to increase even more, so at least 10% in 2022. So obviously there's a lot of sentiment around the things going up and to the right. So again, there doesn't look like there's an end in sight to this increase. Now we'll jump into the compensation benchmarks as well as volume and velocity numbers. So starting out with a little bit about the data. So on a quarterly basis, we track thousands of searches. Our data tends to lean very VC oriented. This is all, platform data running through Thrive that's anonymized and aggregated from opt-in clients. And our data tends to lean a little bit VC oriented, a little bit growth equity. Go-to-market roles have a slightly higher allocation that you can see here. So if you see any of the data points that might be a little bit off, it might be a little bit of the leaning of our data, but in general, we have a good sample and good aggregate view of the space. And we do track data from executive search firms, in-house recruiting teams, leadership recruiting teams, as well as VC and PE equity talent partners from VC and private equity firms. So jumping into a very quick overview, executive base compensation was up 7% year over year in 2021. This is very in line with inflation, which we saw before. Executive searches, demand for volume of net new searches was up an astonishing 72% year over year, which is quite a bit. And then we have search velocity was 6% faster last year. This is a very interesting data point because if you look at the last 3 quarters, we've actually seen velocity slow down. So number of days increase over the last 3 quarters. So things seem like they're slowing down, but as a whole, 2021 was faster than 2020, despite the challenges with the talent market. Getting into a little bit more detail here, we're looking at median cash comp by role. So I'll first kind of explain this chart a little bit. So in the first column there, you have the functions that we track. These are the top functions that we have the best data on. Our report has some zoom in details that's going to be released next week. But for here, we're looking at roles on the left-hand side there. And then in the second column, we have median base salary. So this is just base of all of 2021. And we look at that year over year in the third column. And we look at total compensation, which includes just cash comp. So that's base plus bonus. We're still looking for a way to kind of quantify equity so it makes sense and it's apples to apples from small companies to large companies. So we're still figuring that out. But for right now, total comp is both base and bonus. And we look at total comp increase year over year in that last column there. So as a whole, HR, the base compensation for HR is up 9%, which is a bit of an outlier there. Marketing OTE is up, total comp for base and bonus is up 7% year over year, which seems like a bit of an outlier. CFO and finance role OTE is up 6% year over year. And, kind of surprising on the other end of the spectrum is CEO base and base compensation was flat year over year, and the OT was actually down 4% year over year. So at this point, we have a poll to release, and we're going to be asking folks here what they see in terms of cash compensation. Which roles have you seen the most comp increase? So I'll give you a few seconds to select your option. And Steve, we're going to get your point of view in just a second, but you had an interesting point around CEO base and OTE and the fact that we're not tracking equity there. If you want to share with the group of some of your theory around why CEO comp's probably flattered down year over year.
Look, I mean, I think the equity upside, at least in the private equity space where we play, and I'm sure for your venture clients as well, is where the real money is. I think of the functions that have been willing to make that compromise for additional equity upside versus higher base, I think that's probably why you're seeing that a bit flatter.
And then from a role perspective, what roles are you seeing, Steve, that have the highest increase?
Yeah, I think it's, from our perspective, it's very consistent with this data. CFOs are the hardest to recruit, and as a consequence, because of the competitiveness in the market, I think we've had to go up on CFO comp. The other piece for us, Audax has a buy and build model, so we're buying platform businesses that are going to triple to quadruple in size in 3 to 5 years. That presents a lot of challenges in building out an organization, in hiring enough people and integrating acquisitions, et cetera. And consequently, we've stepped up the level of CHRO that we will bring into our businesses earlier on. So we've also been candidly paying up for that role. So we're not, looking to hire a tactical VP of HR who's going to worry about comp and benefits and compliance related issues. We're looking for a C-suite executive who sits around the table with the rest of the leadership team and as a strategic partner to the CEO in scaling the business from a people and organization perspective. So I'm not at all surprised to see that number going up, because I think that's a trend, at least in private equity, that you're seeing in more of those businesses.
And it seems like the audience is in agreement with you. 38% are saying that CHRO, HR role has seen the most increase in compensation. So definitely seems like folks on the call are on the same page.
We did have a question about the average size of company reflected in the comp data.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually one of the first ones we get in our community roundtables as well. So it's a little bit of a story of a foot in boiling water and a foot in ice cold water. In our final report that's going to be released next week, we're going to have this data, the median base and total comp by role and by company size. So it'll actually be segmented by the size of the company. So if these numbers seem too high or too low, we'll have more detail next week. But this one is a really good aggregate view. So it's a median of multiple size companies, both VC, PE backed, as well as public companies. So it's hard to get a really solid median, but we do segment that out in the final report. Great. So moving on to compensation by employee count, some of this I think is obvious. So the bigger companies are going to be paying higher salaries on average. Middle market companies are somewhere in the middle, and then the smaller companies are going to have the lowest comp. So I think that makes sense overall. But if you look at all of 2021 and compare it to 2022, we actually saw the biggest year-over-year increase in that larger company segment. So companies with over 1,000 employees saw base comp increase by 8% year over year. And if you look at the roles that are really buoying that performance, marketing and engineering roles seem to be that. So the marketing engineering roles in those larger companies were up 18 and 17% respectively. And we've seen a lot of this. There's pockets of concentration based on the ownership type or the size of the company and specific roles. And we've seen, HR, marketing, and engineering as being outliers in multiple categories there. But it was interesting to me, at least, that the larger companies are seeing the most comp increase year over year. They're always going to average to be, higher comp than the other size companies, but just year over year increase. It was interesting to see them tick up the most. And then if we look at total compensation by in-state and out-of-state, it's a chart you're seeing here. To be completely candid, this is our best attempt at getting remote versus local hires, and it's not a perfect science. So we're using in-state hires and out-of-state hires as a proxy for that. So what we're looking at is that the candidate was hired in the state of the company that hired them, or the opposite. They were from outside of the state of the company that hired them. And overall, from Q1 of 2021, you can see that out-of-state hires have had, on average, higher compensation. And as the amount of as the amount of out-of-state hires have opened up with more remote hiring, that number is kind of averaged out more closely aligned with the in-state hires there. We think what that is early on in that 2020 timeframe, a lot of these out-of-state hires were high-ranking executives that were relocated. So they might have been hired from out of state, but they were likely relocated. And then on the in-state side, we think now there could be a premium being paid to local hires. So again, it's not a perfect science, and we're using this as a proxy for remote placements versus local placements. But what we're seeing here is that remote placements could be taking a discount. And when we look at our data, we've seen that year over year, those in-state hires have seen a 7% increase in compensation, while the out-of-state hires have remained flat year over year. So, the question kind of goes out to the broader group here of whether or not you're paying remote hires less. I know there's a lot of nuance here, but on average, are you paying remote hires less than you're paying in-state local hires? And there's a lot of murkiness to that. So I apologize for that. But, Steve, I'd love your point of view. When we caught up about this, I know that you had a lot of nuance and a lot of explanation, but, what is your point of view around this? And are you seeing discounts being paid to remote hires?
Yeah, I mean, as we shared in the pre-call, I'm not sure what to make of this slide. To be honest with you, I think you're the Q2 and Q3 data for 2021. I'm being different there. I don't know what it feels like. That might be more of an outlier than anything else. I think in general, the out-of-state hires are always going to be a bit higher because it's usually involving recruiting somebody away from where they are into another place, and there'll be a slight uptick on compensation, whether it's driven by just cost of living in the geography or the fact that you're moving and you're going to want to get paid for that. So I think without the strange times that we're living through, this chart probably has that red line always higher, just because of the nature of hiring and recruiting and moving someone from one state to another.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it looks like the majority of folks on the call here are saying that they're not paying remote hires less. So I think that your points in our pre-call around cost of living and whether or not you're going to try to pay those remote hires less, probably shaking out to not be the case. It seems great in theory, but probably a little bit harder in practice. Any kind of point of view there, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this. That we're not looking at anything different because of the remote hires from a compensation level standpoint.
Makes sense. So now we're jumping into new executive positions. So this is search volume, the amount of searches that are being opened and being closed in a given quarter. And this does align pretty well with some of the other metrics that we're looking at. But when we look at total new opens as a whole, there was 72% more executive searches open last year than the previous year. And when we zoom into some of the more concentrated areas, you're seeing that HR, marketing, and product are the outliers there. HR with close to 170% year-over-year increase, marketing up close to 100%, and product up close to 120%. So we're seeing that this the additional comp for those HR hires. There's obviously a supply and demand issue here.
And just I would add, Mike, we saw we track both C-level searches and then all searches that we're involved with our portfolio companies. We have about 50 plus portfolio companies, and we only track kind of VP level and above. But we saw the C-level searches year over year, 2020 to 2021 rose 16%, but all searches rose 63% for us. So it was going from 2020 to 2021 was quite a leap on the volume of searches.
Wow, yeah, that's a crazy increase. And then, I know you had a good point of view here too, Steve, but when we look at total search velocity, days to close, the light blue here is the 75th percentile. So those that have the longest search cycles, the days to close. The middle darker blue is the median. So that's the median somewhere in the middle. And then we have the 25th percentile, so the fastest days to close. And if you look at it overall, you can see, starting way back in 2021, which feels like a lifetime ago at this point, we saw a pretty significant boost when remote hiring or virtual hiring and remote placements really started to become a big thing in that late Q4 2020 through the first half of 2021. So you saw a lot of acceleration in that search cycle time in that time period. And then if you look more recently over the last few quarters, you're seeing that things are starting to tick back up. So a lot of the same benefits from the virtual hiring remote phase, but now we're having this significant, competition for talent, which I think is correcting some of those pieces there. But I know you had a pretty good analysis on that, Steve. What's your point of view on a slide like this?
Yeah, so we're not seeing that uptick. And I mean, I'm always cynical on sort of days to close and search firms' positioning of that. At the end of the day, it's kind of like it's still 90 to 120 days is how long it's going to take, and they're going to be outliers on both ends. We have not seen the uptick. I haven't looked at our data on a quarterly basis, but we saw average days to close go from 136 in 2020 down to 93 in 2021. So we actually saw a pretty dramatic acceleration from a an overall standpoint, and really quick turnaround time on a couple of functional searches. Like our HR searches dropped dramatically, even though we upped the bar of what we were looking for. Our time to close on those searches went way down in 2021, as did CFO, thankfully, but it had a bad number to start from in 2020. The baseline was a little different, but we did manage to improve that quite a bit. But I've not seen the uptick that you guys are seeing in this data, thankfully.
Yeah, hopefully it stays that way. We have seen that the last 3 quarters have seen a slow increase. But yeah, hopefully that's a blip, maybe something towards the end of the year. Oh, I just skipped a slide. Okay. So now diving into search velocity by functional role here, you can see that overall the days to close were 6% faster. So I think as an aggregate view, Steve, I think we shared the same point of view. We've seen the same point of view around overall searches are faster last year. It's just more recently that things have started to tick up, and that CFO and finance role were actually 1% slower. Which, it seems like that does not align with your experience. So it's pretty interesting. That, in the broader data set, overall pretty much faster across the board. And when you zoom into some of the roles, you see that not all of them are seeing the same benefits. And at this point, we're going to open up a poll to ask the broader audience. This question is around general demand. So which roles are you seeing the most demand for? And Steve, I'm curious, your point of view here. I know you said that HR, you're seeing the most comp increase. When it comes to actual demand, which roles are you seeing the highest demand for?
Well, in our model, it's CFO. That's from a volume perspective, just because of the buy and build model that we have. We're almost always going out and recruiting a CFO for a new platform business. But I would say it's CFO, CHRO. We're doing a little bit more on the marketing side than we have historically, but we're pretty diverse in the types of industries that we cover. So I know a lot of your data probably skews more toward tech companies. We definitely see marketing roles in the tech sector, but we also do industrial, business services, consumer, healthcare. We are seeing those industries beginning to look at CMO roles more often for us than they have in the past. The other thing I would say about my data too versus yours is we do skew ours a bit in that we'll talk about this later on objectives, but our goal of building out an internal talent network where we're nurturing relationships with portfolio alumni, people who we've met over the years, et cetera. So we do close some searches in 5 days, right? I mean, if we already know someone, that's how we're tracking our data. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily gone out to a retained search. So if those seem artificially low, there may be some of those types of events factored into it.
Yeah, we tend to look at the median to try to get some of those extremes out of the set. But yeah, I think that the audience is basically, again, agreeing with you there, Steve. So it looks like CFO is the highest demand, 57% saying that CFO has had the highest demand. So it seems like it's the hardest to place. I think when you look at the days to close, I know you said you saw those searches actually speed up last year, but we've seen that they were the slowest of the group. So they actually got a little bit slower while the whole got faster, right? So that kind of foots with the demand issue we're seeing. Great. So now we'll jump into a survey we did with about 150 executive search leaders across search firms, in-house executive search talent, and then VCPE talent partners. And we were essentially asking what their outlook was for the next year, which is now 2022. The first question here is around bullishness, bearishness around moving into the next year. Obviously, 2021 was great by almost every account. And the question is, how much more can we kind of sustain that velocity? How much higher can we go from here with frothy markets and everything? And it seems like everyone's still very bullish on where we're going to go. So more than half of folks said that they were expecting at least an 11% increase year over year. So, not just sustaining the current trajectory that we got to last year, but also increasing by at least 11%. And only 24% expected either flat or to decrease year over year. So it seems like overall folks are bullish heading into this year. Steve, it seems like you're somewhere in the middle there, right? What's your point of view around next year, into your anticipation in terms of the trends that we saw this year?
Yeah, I mean, the data so far, if January is any indication, is it's going to be up pretty significantly for us from a volume perspective again this year.
Okay.
It certainly, it equates for us to new deals. And, we had a phenomenal year broadly at Audax last year. We're forecasting and planning for an uptick this year. And so far, we're seeing that both from a deal flow perspective as well as the build out of the leadership teams in the portfolio.
Yeah, all really great signs. I mean, probably is taken with a little bit of cautious optimism based on how much we've seen over last year. But yeah, overall, it seems like everyone's pretty bullish on this next year. And then we asked a question around top initiatives. So they were allowed to select 3, which is why the percentages are the way that they are. But our top 3 here really aligned to a lot of the dynamics we've been talking about. So number 1 was proactive pipeline building. This has not been a top 3 option over the last 3 years we've done this survey. And, this is number 1 this year. So more than half of folks are saying this is a top initiative for them to go back in and rebuild those pipelines. I'm sure they've gotten depleted with all of the demand and open, new pools of prospects with remote hiring. And then the number 2 here is better leveraging data and analytics, which we've seen tick up the board year over year for the last 3 years we've been doing this survey. And then rounding out that top 3 is initiatives around DE&I. So this is for the last couple of years has been the number 1 initiative, and is still, over half of folks are selecting this, and it rounds out our top 3. I'm curious, Steve, with your initiatives for this year, does this foot with what you're seeing, and what's your number 1?
Yeah, it definitely fits with what we're seeing, and I would say that DE&I has been top of mind for us for a while. So while it may have fallen down a couple of percentage points here, it still is top of mind for us and sort of everything we're doing and building out the teams and the portfolio companies. But I totally agree with the proactively building out talent networks and pipelines, and for us, that isn't about the 4th one of kind of internal or sort of driving a recruiting team internally. So at Audax, we don't do searches, right? We're leveraging third parties to do those searches. Yet at the same time, we try to solve the problem through our internal talent network quickly before we go to search. But if we don't have an obvious answer, we're immediately going to go to a firm to execute a search for us. But what we're trying to do is to increase the percentage of roles that are filled from our network. Every year we're trying to do that. So proactively kind of managing those and making sure from a standpoint of data and analytics that we can find the right kind of people. So if we're looking at a deal in a particular industry and we know we're going to have to hire a CFO or perhaps a CEO, how quickly can I go in to Thrive and say, okay, show me all the CFOs in this sector who we've interviewed in the last 3 years. And then we rate them. So I quickly have a sense of, are there 3 to 5 people we ought to just pick up the phone and call, or do we definitely need to kick off the search today? So yeah, I totally agree with, at least from our perspective, these top 3 are our top 3.
Yeah, and we've heard a lot of that in the community, which you're a part of, but it seems like speed and quality of hire matters most to the investor talent partner. Obviously, price is a consideration, but when you stack rank the importance, it's getting the right person hired as quickly as possible. It seems to be like the mantra, right?
It does, but I remember I joined Audax about 6 years ago, and when I came on board, one of the comments that was made to me is, "Hey, Steve, you're here to help us find good people faster." Yeah. And I said, yeah, I'm going to adjust that a little bit. I'm here to help you find good people every time, or the right person all the time. And if you have to sacrifice a little bit of time to get the right person, that's a no-brainer. If you get the wrong person, the consequences are just way too costly.
Yeah, and that has to be a hard thing to stick to with the talent environment that we're currently in. But I mean, yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense. We probably could have a separate webinar just on that topic. The next question we asked was on the other end of the coin. So obstacles going into 2022, and the number one here was very specific. So we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the great reshuffling, great resignation, but the idea of this like uncertainty and flakiness of candidates seems to be a real issue. So late stage candidates dropping out of searches, mainly due to multiple offers or counter offers, came in as the number one obstacle going into 2022. The second one here was search firm capacity issues, and this is on both sides of the table. So firms acknowledging their own capacity issue, as well as clients acknowledging the capacity issues of those search firms. And then the third one here, which aligns to the number one initiative, is not having enough quality pipeline of candidates. So I'll turn it back over to you, Steve. I'm curious, of these top three, is it in this order? Would you switch up the order? How do you look at the obstacles looking at 2022?
Yeah, boy, it's a loaded question with a lot of different ways to go. I mean, frankly, part of the challenge of search is you're dealing with a very unpredictable product and people. So, one of the things I think we look for in our search partners is on this first one to really understand what's going on with candidates. So yeah, candidates can be flaky and maybe they have multiple offers, but at the same time, I put a lot of the responsibility on the search partner to really understand what's going on with the candidates that they presented to us. And if they have a separate line of communication into them, trying to get into their heads on what they're thinking about. Because I get disappointed if a candidate says, no, I'm going to take that offer versus the one you gave us. But I'm more disappointed if the search partner didn't understand the dynamic that was at play at that stage of the search. So I worry about that, but we try to reinforce that throughout the process with our search partners that we're working with. I say that I think the one that scares me the most here is actually the second one, is just the search firm capacity issues. I've had more firms tell me right now, and I appreciate it. Steve, I can't even pitch on it. The ones that scare me are the ones who are, no, we're fine. We'll take it on. And they're overloaded. So it's a time that I don't think people who are in the retained search world have ever seen from a standpoint of the volume of work that's out there. And managing it and being honest with the clients, I think, is critical, because it won't always be that way. And those of us who buy search will remember these days when it gets to be leaner times and how we were treated. So honesty is a better policy there than anything else from the search firms. And pipeline quality candidates, that's always a challenge, and frankly, that's where good search firms are going to differentiate themselves. I don't care so much about what's going into the top of the funnel. I care about them telling me the 3 to 5 people we should meet. How the sausage is made, it's not rocket science. The value is getting those high caliber candidates to us that we should be meeting as a part of the process.
Yeah, jump to the ending. I'm curious, backing up to that first, the number one obstacle. What we've been hearing is a lot of those dynamics that were typically, gut feel or intuition of when a candidate's sold. A lot of that's changing now. The dynamics are changing, and folks are, more flaky. Are you seeing that as a whole, or are you just relying on search firms to kind of monitor those dynamics for you? And have you not seen a big uptick in that area?
Look, I don't know if it's flaky. I just think it's a more competitive market. So if it's a really strong CFO with private equity experience who understands, high-paced M&A, and we're trying to bring that person into one of our sectors, and they have 4 offers from other top-tier private equity firms in the same sector, it's a tougher decision for them to make, and we have to be, all the comp data that you're sharing, we may have to step up on comp. We may have to sweeten the equity package. I think it's more about competition than it is kind of the flakiness of the candidate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, all roads lead back to supply and demand, right?
Yep.
And then when we, in that vein, right? So as we're thinking through what measures folks are taking and suggesting to their hiring teams in 2022 to get more competitive. So comp's one variable there, but there's a lot of things we could do to accelerate things and try to, get those candidates in the door sooner rather than later. The top three are shortening the hiring process. So like removing stages. We've heard a lot about that. Opening roles up to remote and hybrid work, which I think a lot of companies are doing, but there's still some that are resistant to doing that. And then, the third one there, which, I think is obvious and it's going to, change things quite a bit, is increasing that base and variable compensation. Just as a note, we did separate equity from that, which shows up later on the list, but the top three there are accelerating the process, opening roles up to remote and hybrid. And the third one is, increasing comp. Based on that last comment, Steve, would you put comp number one here, or would you stack rank this way?
I'd put comp and openness to remote and hybrid the top. I'd say probably one of the biggest factors we've seen since the pandemic hit on our ability to recruit executives is to take a relo or a specific geographic requirement out of the equation. So if suddenly we're looking for a CFO for a company that's in Dallas, but that person can stay in Atlanta or stay in Chicago and commute, do some virtual, do some commute where before we may not have allowed that. That change has had a significant impact on our ability to get higher caliber candidates further along in the process faster.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that aligns to a lot of what we're seeing here. And it looks like the increasing equity packages is about 32%, which I would, when we released this survey, I was anticipating that being a little bit higher. I thought folks would kind of play with equity more than base and variable, but I guess you have to be competitive on all fronts there, huh?
Yeah.
And then when we think of how long we expect the conditions of the job market to continue, nearly half of folks expect basically this talent squeeze to last throughout, at least this year. So, that's a lot of folks expecting not a whole lot of change. And if you look at the dynamics we've kind of talked about on this call, I'm not sure why we would expect things to get much better, right? I mean, Steve, do you have a point of view here around, like, do you think that the dynamic specifically around talent acquisition for executives is going to get easier? As obviously you're pretty bullish on this year. Do you think there's going to be any kind of economies of scale or any efficiencies to be gained this year that would make the talent piece of this a little easier?
No. I think it's going to be harder this year than it was last year. I just think that the numbers are going to continue to go up, and even if the economy softens and things change, I don't know how dramatic an impact that's going to have on the executive level, right? So I think this is going to be a continued trend for a while.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the dry powder, when you look at inflation, when you look at the amount of executives that have already been placed, it's pretty mind-blowing to think that it could get much more competitive than this. But I mean, by all accounts that we're seeing, it looks like it's going in that direction. So now we'll jump into our spotlight section, and we'll pass it off to Steve to walk through the role specifically of a PE talent partner and how that's evolving over time, and dynamics that are related to that as we're going through all the things that we've been going through over the last couple of years.
Sure, happy to share. And this is just one opinion of what's going on here, but I'm happy to sort of share my perspective on what I'm seeing. Background wise, I did this for 5 years in a venture fund at Kodiak, kind of the first talent partner role, and that was during kind of the early 2000s, so kind of 2004 to 2009. I think there were 35 or 40 of us in the venture world that were doing some kind of talent recruiting partner, whatever. And there were very few, frankly, at that time in private equity. Fast forward to today, I've been at Audax almost 6 years. I came in to build out the portfolio human capital function. I've since added a VP to my team who's helping with kind of the recruiting side on VP level searches in the portfolio companies. I've also added an analyst. The role here, portfolio human capital includes what I'll call talent acquisition and the recruiting of executives into the portfolio companies, but it also includes the providing sort of strategic HR guidance to the portfolio companies. So that is my purview as it stands right now. Since I've been here, our portfolio support team has also grown in 6 years from 3 people to over a dozen now. We've built out capabilities in other functional specialty areas. So we have someone who leads office of the CFO, office of the CIO, and other generalists that work with the portfolio companies. I think what that's going to lead to for us, and where I'm seeing this happen more broadly in the private equity world, is a clearer delineation between somebody who is the talent/recruiting partner and somebody who is doing HR and human capital as a partner. So where I may be dealing with, 12 to 15 open C-level searches, I'm also dealing with 50 portfolio companies that are going through benefits renewals, thinking about broker changes, asking questions about learning management systems, culture, and engagement. What am I going to do? I got to develop a mission, vision, value statement. Who should I work with? That's just a lot to do. And it's also, for some people can be generalists in that area, and some people, like, I'm not an HR person. I know enough to be dangerous, and I know enough to leverage third-party service provider relationships that we have here to help our portfolio companies. But I think what we'll see in these roles is a division of those two things. So there will be people that will go down the path and say, I'm the recruiting partner at this private equity firm. My goal in life is to make sure that we have the right leadership teams in the portfolio companies, and to build out and manage our talent network, maybe manage relationships with portfolio alumni, try to get them back into portfolio companies for another stint. And then we'll see somebody coming in as the HR partner. And what they'll be doing is saying, okay, we bought a new platform. From an organization standpoint, what do we need to build? Org design. What do we need to build for an HR department? What kind of HR leader should come in? What are we doing for benefits? What are we doing for comp? And those types of things. And I think if you take the time to go look at various private equity firms. Now, I mentioned that number, there were like 35 in the venture side 15 years ago. There's probably 75 to 100 people on the private equity side right now in some role in this capacity. And if you go and look from firm to firm, you will see that there are now people who are more in that HR role versus the talent or recruiting role. I see less of the last bullet here. There are some firms that are going to build out internal talent acquisition capabilities. I personally, I don't like that model. I just don't. You create kind of an internal vendor relationship there, where I always say, if you view this role as cost avoidance for search fees, it's not going to work. This is about strategic value add in accelerating the value agenda and building a more valuable business. And the role has to be positioned to driving that and being critical in that path. Somebody says, oh, well, I could probably save $2 million in search fees if I bring somebody in to do searches. I think that's not a good idea. So those are, Mike, those are kind of my views on this, and I'm, happy to answer questions. And again, it's just one person's view, but at a high level, I think you'll see more delineation between HR and talent. And I think you will continue to see this role becoming more prominent within private equity and venture.
Yeah, in a lot of those dynamics, with what we're hearing in our talent community, that's comprised mostly of VC and PE talent partners, the increased hiring of that role across VC and PE is crazy. Like, I think the numbers might even be up from your estimate there. And the requests from portcos really seem to be centered around talent acquisition. I mean, obviously there's broader needs, but the number one need that we've seen in our survey is around TA, to your point. And these lean teams are managing both in both on the VC and PE side in our experience. And then our data shows that only 20% of them are running searches at all, let alone running the majority of their searches. So I think a lot of what you're saying, a lot of that sentiment, I think there's people that would relate to that quite a bit. And our data shows that, and the feedback from our community shows that too. So it'd be interesting to see, how much it's evolved over the last, 12 to 18 months, like what it will look like in the next couple of years. Do you think these changes are like imminent in the next year or so? Or do you think it's a little bit more of a 5-year evolution?
No, I think it's going to go faster rather than slower. And I do think, look, the models are going to be different. I mean, to my point about not being that big a believer in an internal talent acquisition team, you look at like what Andreessen Horowitz has built from an internal capability standpoint. They do a great job, and that's a really powerful model for them. But it's also an outlier. I mean, they're kind of like a search firm in and of themselves internally. But I think you're going to look. Time is money in this business. You can't wait too long. If you view it as a critical role that's going to help drive value, the sooner you have it, the better you're going to do for returns for your investors.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on. So I really appreciate the point of view. I think this is a very important topic that will, increase in its importance over the years. So we'll keep an eye on it and keep everyone tuned, obviously write our content around it. But I think we can transition now, Monica, to the Q&A portion.
Yeah, we have an interesting question come in from Daniel Portes about the current inflation numbers are, temporary for some. So how does that affect compensation, or how we're thinking about those compensation numbers? He was saying that he's seeing comp adjustments at 4 to 5% and not 7%. So wanted to get some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd love to get Steve's point of view, but what we're seeing in like the broader data set is, again, like different stories for different segments, different, like the size of the company, the role, the demand for the role, like all of these are contributing factors. I don't think it's a blanket 7%. I think that's where we kind of land at the aggregate view. But I mean, the question of does it align 1-to-1 with inflation or just track closely to it is interesting. But any kind of anecdotal feedback there, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think your survey data is more around executive comp year over year changes, right? So, I mean, when it comes down to compensation trends for like employees at company X within our portfolio, where it typically might have been a 3% bump for the employees, we were seeing companies needing to do 4 to 5%. Now, that's broadly across sort of what is the annual salary increase going to be. So I think the 7% number and broader kind of 3 to 5% numbers for the employee population are just, apples and oranges. They're two different things. So I would agree. We're not seeing 7% across the board, but I'm not surprised that you saw 7% in the data from the closed searches year over year.
Yeah, assuming that they're all net new hires and not succession. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes. Yep. We had another question come in specifically about the talent pool. So Terry asked, is there a distinction between the skill sets required for an executive at a Fortune 50 company compared to a smaller company? The definition of a president or vice president at a smaller company is often equivalent to a manager or director at a Fortune 50 company.
Yeah, so again, we're middle market. So the responsibilities of a manager at a big company might be dollar-wise comparable to being the CEO of a middle market private equity company, but the role isn't, right? So, and it makes it hard sometimes when we're trying to recruit an executive into a $500 million company and they're coming from a $10 billion company, right? So the person who has the breadth of skills and responsibility probably doesn't equate to being able to go into that role. You might be able to find somebody who ran a piece of that business at the same scale, but they're probably not going to be able to go down and provide the sort of experience as an executive leading an entire business from a standpoint of the different functions that are reporting to him or her. I think it's just totally different. That's part of the challenge recruiting into, at least in our world, into the middle market, is executives to know how to go into a smaller setting where they're going to have fewer resources, but they still have the same responsibility of running a business.
Yep, that definitely makes sense. We had another question come in, this one focusing a little bit more on COVID. So how does COVID factor into the 72% increase year over year on searches? Especially, how does 2021 compare to previous non-COVID years?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard without pulling out the crystal ball to speak definitively about that, because we can look at some of the trends in the data and we can see what's happened, but usually figuring out exactly what has caused it is much harder. You figure a lot of the industries that have been booming from COVID are still booming, and a lot of the industries that were impacted negatively will be coming back, hopefully, as restrictions ease. But yeah, without knowing what's going to happen with COVID and its broader impact on the economics of our business, it's hard to tell. Steve, you have a point of view there?
Yeah, look, I mean, I remember Friday, March 13th, 2020 really well, right? Not only was it Friday the 13th, that was like the day everybody sort of started to shut stuff down. And if you remember, from March until about June of 2020, the search industry thought it was dead. The large firms, a couple of which laid off like 20% of their employees, a lot of their candidate developers and researchers, because they thought that the industry was going to tank. And I also thought personally, hey, it's going to be really hard to get these C-level searches done without meeting people. And I was completely wrong. The Zoom world changed, candidly, in my opinion, for the better, the search process. This old days of like, hey, let's run a super day in Boston. We're going to bring in 6 candidates, each of whom are going to meet 6 people on the deal team for this role. And then you realize it's going to take 2 months to coordinate that day for calendars. Suddenly you do it in 2 days over Zoom calls, and you're that much farther along in a process. So, I think it's had a profound impact. And now, fast forward to today, the search firms have more business than they've ever had. So, yeah, it's just hard to know what we're different than we were 2 years ago. How different will we be in a year? Who knows? Right now, it feels like we're kind of on the sort of a road back to quasi-normal. I don't know if there's another variant around the corner. None of us do.
Yeah, and rereading Josh's question, the example he gives too, the question of whether the COVID suppression in 2020 is really like what made that 72% increase year over year. I can speak to that. So in 2019, it was a very good year for executive search across the board. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was somewhere between 30 and 40% increase year over year. And then 2020 was a story of two halves. The first half was very low. I think it was 30 to 50% less searches in the first half of 2020 compared to 2019. And then over the second half, things caught up quite a bit. So basically 2020 was somewhere around flat year over year in terms of search volume. And then you saw the 72% increase. So that could have been some pent up demand, to Josh's point. And by all leading indicators, we don't see things slowing down. So it seems like we're going to keep going on this trajectory.
Yeah, for sure. I think we have time for one last question. Someone specifically has one for Steve. Steve, curious to get your input on equity allocation and how they're thinking about it as it relates to attracting candidates while keeping cash comp in line.
That's a great one to end with. Look, I mean, it's for us, it's a little bit different. I know that this survey has skewed very much toward VC deals. So in the private equity world, just the way in which equity is allocated is different. We have to look at it. Typically we own a business for 3 to 5 years. So we're looking at what in the base case at exit, the equity is going to be worth. And then we almost, when we're typically presenting it to a candidate, we just amortize it over 3 or 5 years and say, look, your cash comp is X. Your equity upside, because a lot of these executives may be coming from a larger company where they're getting annual grants or something. They're trying to equate to, like, I was making this much here. How much am I going to make here? And it's also, we have to then in our tech deals compete against, well, what percentage of the company am I getting again? Well, no, I want 12%. I'm like, okay, I got a really high probability for you that you're going to make this much money. It's a different model than percentage of the company. But I think for us, we've been looking at it as presenting to them, okay, if you're here for our hold of 4 to 5 years, here's your base, here's your bonus, here's what the equity is going to be worth, again, in the base case, not the upside. So, amortize that and figure out if that equates to what your expectations are for annual overall compensation.
That nuance makes it very hard for us to normalize that over early stage VC and public companies. So hopefully
we have the same problem internally trying to figure it out, right? Do I use the base case or do I use the upside? Because basically we come in and say, look, if we get out at a 3x money on money, here's what you make.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. Thanks again, Steve, for all the thoughtful insight. This was really great. And we'll follow up with many of these other questions we didn't get to offline. And please keep in mind that I think it's next Tuesday, right, Monica? We should have our final report. So don't forget to download the entire report, which will have segmentation by roles and company size. So you can zoom into something that's a little bit more apples to apples with your experience.
Yep, that sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks so
Take
much.
care.
See you.
Bye.